The ballroom at Ashworth House was ablaze with 1,000 candles when Edmund Ashworth, Viscount Kellington, told his wife of 3 years that their marriage was over. He chose the moment with what he believed was strategic precision between the second and third waltz, when the musicians were tuning their instruments and the guests were occupied with champagne and gossip and the particular kind of performance that characterized the autumn season in London. He chose the location with equal care, the portrait gallery, a narrow corridor lined with ancestral faces whose painted eyes had witnessed 3 centuries of Ashworth family negotiations, arguments, and carefully managed scandals. And he chose his words with the deliberate neutrality of a man who had rehearsed this conversation in his head approximately 40 times and believed himself to be handling the situation with admirable composure. "Amelia," he said, catching her elbow as she passed through the gallery on her way back from the retiring room. "We need to speak." She turned. Amelia Ashworth, née Thornton, was 25 years old. She wore a gown of pale blue silk that had cost more than most families earned in a year, but less than Edmund's last hunting trip to Scotland. Her dark hair was dressed in the current fashion, her pearls were modest, and her expression was the same calm, pleasant mask she wore at every social function. Polite interest edged with the particular wariness that came from 3 years of marriage to a man who spoke to her primarily when there was something he needed her to do or something he needed her to stop doing. "Of course," she said. "What is it?" Edmund glanced down the gallery. 2 guests were examining a portrait of the 4th Viscount at the far end, but they were engrossed in their own conversation and unlikely to overhear. Still, he lowered his voice. "I have made a decision regarding our arrangement." "Our arrangement, not our marriage." Amelia noted the phrasing. She noted everything Edmund said, the way one notes the weather or the time, information that might prove relevant later, stored away for future reference. "What decision is that?" she asked. Her voice was perfectly level. Edmund straightened his shoulders. He had the posture of a man who believed he was about to do something difficult but necessary, like dismissing an incompetent steward or putting down a lame horse. "I think it would be best," he said, "if we ended this marriage, formally, legally. I have spoken with my solicitor. The process can be managed discreetly." Amelia looked at him. She looked at the man she had married when she was 22 years old, the man whose mother had assured her that Edmund was steady and reliable and would make an excellent husband once he settled into his responsibilities. She looked at the face that had smiled at her during their courtship with practiced charm and had regarded her for the past 3 years with increasing indifference. She looked at his eyes, which were focused somewhere past her left shoulder, as though he were already mentally cataloging the relief this conversation would bring him. "I see," she said. "May I ask why?" "We are not suited," Edmund said. The answer came quickly, as though he had prepared it in advance. "We have little in common. Our temperaments are incompatible. I believe we would both be happier pursuing separate lives." "Happier," Amelia repeated. "Yes. And by separate lives, you mean you wish to marry someone else?" Edmund's jaw tightened fractionally. "That is not the primary consideration. But it is a consideration." It was not a question. Edmund exhaled through his nose. "Miss Hartley and I have an understanding, but that is secondary to the broader issue, which is that you and I are fundamentally mismatched." Miss Hartley. Catherine Hartley, daughter of a wealthy industrialist, possessed of a substantial fortune and a laugh that carried across ballrooms with the subtlety of a hunting horn. Amelia had met her twice. The second time, she had watched Edmund watch Catherine across a crowded drawing room, with the kind of focused attention he had not directed at Amelia since approximately 6 weeks into their marriage. "I see," Amelia said again. Her voice remained calm. Her hands, folded at her waist, did not tremble. "And you are telling me this now, at your family's ball, because I wanted you to hear it from me directly," Edmund interrupted. "Before the solicitor contacts you. I thought that was the decent thing to do." The decent thing. Amelia felt something cold and precise settle in her chest. It was not heartbreak. Heartbreak required the breaking of something that had been whole, and her marriage had never achieved wholeness. It had been an arrangement from the beginning. His family needed her dowry to settle debts accumulated by Edmund's late father's investments in a series of failed shipping ventures. And her family needed the social elevation that came with marrying a viscount, even a viscount whose finances were in disarray. They had performed their roles adequately. She had managed his household. He had provided her with a title and social position. And if there had been no affection, no intimacy, no partnership beyond the efficient coordination of public appearances, well, that was simply what marriage was for people of their class. Or so she had told herself. But this, being informed that the arrangement was ending in a portrait gallery between waltzes, with the casual dismissiveness of a man canceling a subscription to a newspaper he no longer read, this was something else entirely. "Very decent of you," Amelia said. Her tone was so polite that Edmund visibly relaxed, clearly interpreting her composure as agreement. "I appreciate your directness." "I am glad you understand," Edmund said. "I know this is difficult, but I believe it is the right course for both of us. You are still young. You will have opportunities." "Edmund?" Amelia interrupted gently. "Yes?" "I have a question." "Of course." "Does your mother know about this decision?" Edmund's expression shifted. "I plan to inform her after the ball." "And Miss Hartley? Does she know you are ending one marriage before beginning another?" "She is aware of the situation, yes." "And your solicitor has advised you that a divorce is straightforward, that there will be no scandal, no damage to your standing or mine?" Edmund's jaw tightened again. "The situation can be managed." "Managed," Amelia said. "The way you have managed our marriage, the way you managed to conduct a courtship with Miss Hartley while still legally bound to me, the way you are managing this conversation in a portrait gallery while 200 guests dance in the next room." "Amelia." "I understand perfectly, Edmund." She looked at him with an expression that was still calm, still pleasant, still utterly unreadable. "You wish to end our marriage, you have made your decision, and you believe you are handling this with admirable decency by informing me personally, rather than allowing me to discover it through a solicitor's letter." "That was my intention, yes." "How considerate." Amelia reached up and removed her wedding ring. It was a simple gold band, nothing ornate, worn smooth by 3 years of wear. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, and then she placed it in Edmund's palm and folded his fingers around it. "There," she said. "That simplifies matters, does not it?" Edmund stared at the ring in his hand. He had clearly expected resistance, tears, perhaps a scene that would require management. What he had not expected was this, his wife handing back her ring with the same calm efficiency she brought to managing his household accounts. "Amelia, I assume you would prefer I leave the ball," she asked. "Given the circumstances, it seems appropriate." "Actually," Edmund said, recovering slightly, "I think it would be less conspicuous if you stayed. For appearances. We can discuss the practical arrangements tomorrow." "For appearances," Amelia repeated. "Of course, we must think of appearances." She curtsied. It was a perfect curtsy, the kind she had been taught by her governess at age 12 and had performed at countless social functions with flawless execution. Deep enough to be respectful, shallow enough to indicate that while she acknowledged his position, she was not prostrating herself before it. "Thank you for the conversation, my lord," she said. "I shall return to the ballroom now." She walked past him before he could respond. She walked down the portrait gallery with her spine straight and her head high, past the painted faces of Edmund's ancestors who had witnessed 3 centuries of marriages made and unmade, fortunes won and lost, families risen and fallen. She walked through the door at the end of the gallery and into the corridor that led back to the ballroom, and she stopped. She stopped because her hands were shaking. She stopped because the composure she had maintained throughout that entire conversation was fracturing at the edges, and if she walked into a ballroom full of 200 guests while fracturing, someone would notice. Someone would ask if she was well. Someone would offer sympathy or curiosity or the particular kind of invasive concern that society ladies deployed when they sensed scandal. And Amelia could not, would not, give them that satisfaction. So she stood in the corridor and pressed her hands flat against the cool plaster wall and took 3 slow breaths. In, out, in, out, in, out. And then she heard the music. The orchestra had resumed playing. A waltz. The same waltz that had been playing when Edmund had pulled her aside to inform her that their marriage was over and he was in love with someone else, and would she please stay at the ball for appearances. Amelia listened to the music. She listened to the rise and fall of strings, the steady rhythm of the dance, the sound of 200 people performing the intricate choreography of London society, while she stood alone in a corridor with her marriage dissolved and her future uncertain and her hands still shaking against the wall. And something shifted. Something in her chest that had been tight and controlled for 3 years. Something that had learned to be quiet and accommodating and entirely focused on managing Edmund's needs and expectations and moods. Something that had absorbed every slight and every dismissal and every moment of being treated like competent furniture. That something cracked. Not into pieces, into clarity. Amelia Thornton Ashworth was 25 years old. She had a modest fortune of her own, inherited from her grandmother and held in trust separate from Edmund's control. She had an education that included literature and history and mathematics that her father had insisted upon despite her mother's protests that such learning was wasted on a daughter. She had managed a viscountcy's household for 3 years with efficiency and intelligence, and she had just been informed that her marriage was over by a man who believed he was doing her a favor by handling it with decency. She pushed away from the wall. She smoothed her skirt. She checked her reflection in the window glass. Her hair was still perfectly arranged. Her gown was still immaculate. Her face showed no trace of the fracturing that had been happening beneath it. And then she walked back into the ballroom. The dancing was in full swing. Couples moved across the floor in elegant rotations, the women's gowns creating swirls of color against the polished parquet, the men's dark evening clothes providing contrast. The chandeliers blazed overhead, the champagne flowed, and at the edge of the dance floor, watching with the particular intensity of someone who believed herself to be observing unnoticed, was Catherine Hartley. She was beautiful, Amelia acknowledged with the clinical detachment of someone assessing a painting. Blonde hair dressed in elaborate curls, a gown of rose silk that probably cost more than Amelia's entire seasonal wardrobe. Diamonds at her throat that caught the candlelight with aggressive sparkle. She was laughing at something the gentleman beside her had said, but her eyes kept drifting toward the portrait gallery entrance, clearly waiting for Edmund to return. Amelia walked directly toward her. Catherine saw her coming. The laugh died. The expression shifted from amusement to something guarded. The gentleman beside her excused himself with admirable speed, clearly sensing that he did not want to be present for whatever was about to occur. "Miss Hartley," Amelia said. Her voice was perfectly pleasant. "Good evening." "Lady Kellington," Catherine replied. Her tone was cautious. "I hope you are enjoying the ball." "Immensely," Amelia said, "though I find myself without a dancing partner for this waltz, a tragic oversight." Catherine's eyes widened fractionally. "I am sure." "Would you do me the very great favor," Amelia continued, as though Catherine had not spoken, "of introducing me to your brother? I understand he is an excellent dancer." Catherine stared at her. The request was unusual, but not scandalous. Women did occasionally dance with each other at balls when partners were scarce, though it was more common among younger girls than married women. But there was something in Amelia's tone, something in her smile, that suggested this was not a simple request for a dancing partner. "My brother is engaged for this set," Catherine said carefully. "A pity," Amelia said. "Then I suppose I shall have to dance alone." She turned and walked onto the dance floor. She walked directly into the center of the rotating couples, found a space between 2 pairs, and began to waltz. She waltzed alone. She moved through the steps with perfect precision, one hand raised as though held by an invisible partner, the other resting at her waist, her body moving through the turns and progressions with the muscle memory of 1,000 similar dances. She did not look at the other couples. She did not look at the watching guests, whose conversations were beginning to falter as they noticed the woman waltzing by herself in the middle of the Ashworth ballroom. She simply danced. She danced because Edmund had told her to stay for appearances, and she was staying. She danced because Catherine Hartley was watching with growing horror as the woman whose marriage she had helped destroy performed the most visible, undeniable act of defiance available at a society ball. She danced because 3 years of being quiet and accommodating and utterly focused on managing Edmund's comfort had taught her exactly how society worked, and she knew with perfect certainty that what she was doing right now, waltzing alone at her husband's family ball while still technically married to him, was the kind of thing people would talk about for years. The music swelled. Amelia turned, and the ballroom, which had been filled with conversation and laughter and the ambient noise of 200 people enjoying themselves, went absolutely silent except for the orchestra, which continued playing because the musicians had not yet realized that they should stop. Every eye in the room was on her. Every conversation had ceased. And at the entrance to the portrait gallery, Edmund stood frozen, his face the color of old parchment, clearly realizing that his wife, his soon-to-be former wife, whom he had informed of their impending divorce approximately 8 minutes ago, was creating the exact kind of scene he had hoped to avoid. The waltz continued. Amelia continued with it. She moved through the steps as though nothing unusual was happening, as though waltzing alone in front of 200 stunned guests was the most natural thing in the world. And when the music finally ended, when the last note faded into silence and the entire ballroom held its collective breath, Amelia stopped in the center of the floor. She curtsied to her invisible partner, and then she turned, walked directly to the refreshment table, accepted a glass of champagne from a footman whose hand was shaking, and took a long, deliberate sip. The silence broke. Whispers erupted like a flock of startled birds. Guests turned to each other with wide eyes and barely suppressed excitement. This would be discussed in every drawing room in London for the next month. The woman who waltzed alone at the Ashworth ball, the Viscountess who danced by herself while her husband watched from the doorway. The scandal was immediate, absolute, and entirely self-inflicted, and Amelia, standing at the refreshment table with her champagne, felt something she had not felt in 3 years. She felt free. Edmund crossed the ballroom in 10 strides. His face was no longer pale. It was flushed with anger and humiliation, the kind that came from realizing that one's carefully managed plan had just been demolished by the person one had most underestimated. "What?" he said in a voice that was low and shaking. "Was that?" Amelia took another sip of champagne. "That was a waltz, Edmund. Surely you recognize one. You just... in front of everyone." "Yes," she agreed. "I did." "Why?" "You told me to stay for appearances," she said. Her voice was still perfectly calm. "I'm staying. I'm appearing. I'm even dancing, though admittedly without the partner you have decided to replace me with." Edmund's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You have humiliated me." "I have humiliated myself," Amelia corrected. "There is a difference. You humiliated me in a portrait gallery where no one could see. I humiliated myself in a ballroom where everyone could. I thought it was only fair." "Fair." "You wanted discretion, Edmund. You wanted to manage this quietly. You wanted to end our marriage and begin another one without scandal or difficulty or any inconvenience to yourself, and I might have allowed that. I might have been quiet and accommodating and entirely focused on making this easy for you. The way I've been quiet and accommodating for 3 years while you ignored me, except when you needed something managed." She set down her champagne glass. "But you chose to tell me at a ball, at your family's ball, between waltzes, as though our marriage was so inconsequential that it could be dissolved in the same amount of time it takes the musicians to retune their instruments. So I decided that if you were going to treat our marriage as inconsequential, I would demonstrate exactly how consequential its ending could be." Edmund stared at her. For perhaps the first time in their 3-year marriage, he was seeing her, not as efficient furniture, not as a problem to be managed, not as a wife who required minimal attention and provided maximum convenience, but as a person with agency and intelligence and a will that was entirely separate from his own. "This will ruin you," he said finally. "This will ruin both of us," Amelia corrected. "But I find I do not particularly care about my reputation anymore, Edmund. Reputation is only valuable when one has something to protect. I do not. I have a marriage that is ending, a husband who loves someone else, and a future that is entirely uncertain. What I do not have is any reason to protect your comfort at the expense of my own dignity." She picked up her champagne glass again. "So yes, I waltzed alone, and tomorrow every drawing room in London will be discussing it, and you will explain to your mother and your solicitor and Miss Hartley exactly how your plan for a discreet, well-managed divorce became the most talked-about scandal of the season, and I will be free." She walked away. She walked past the guests who were still whispering and staring. She walked past Catherine Hartley, whose face had gone from horror to something that looked like fear. She walked out of the ballroom, down the main staircase, and out the front door of Ashworth House. The night air was cold against her skin. The street was dark except for the glow of carriage lamps, and Amelia stood on the steps of the house she would no longer live in, breathing in the smell of coal smoke and rain and freedom, and realized that for the first time in 3 years she had no idea what happened next. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was hers. 3 months later, Amelia was living in a modest townhouse in Bloomsbury that she had leased with her grandmother's inheritance. The house was small, 4 rooms, a kitchen, a narrow staircase that creaked, but it was entirely her own. No staff except a daily housekeeper. No social obligations except the ones she chose. No husband whose moods and needs and expectations dictated how she spent her days. She had not seen Edmund since the night of the ball. The divorce proceedings were ongoing, managed by solicitors who communicated through terse letters about property settlements and financial arrangements. Edmund's mother had written once, a letter that managed to be both pleading and accusatory, asking Amelia to reconsider her rash behavior and think of the family's reputation. Amelia had not replied. The scandal had been everything she had expected, and more. The Viscountess who waltzed alone became a story that was retold with increasing embellishment at every social gathering. Some versions claimed she had waltzed for an entire hour. Others insisted she had been weeping throughout. A few suggested she had been intoxicated. None of them were accurate, but Amelia found she did not care. She was no longer part of that world. She had been quietly removed from invitation lists, dropped from social registers, politely excluded from the kinds of gatherings she had attended as Edmund's wife. And instead of the crushing isolation she had feared, she discovered something unexpected. She discovered that London was full of women like her, women who had been divorced or widowed or otherwise freed from marriages that had constrained them, women who gathered in drawing rooms and coffee houses to discuss books and politics and ideas that were not deemed appropriate for polite society, women who wrote and painted and managed their own finances and lived lives that were smaller in scope than the grand ballrooms of Mayfair, but infinitely larger in possibility. Amelia found them. Or perhaps they found her. She was invited to a salon hosted by a writer named Mrs. Phillips, a widow who published essays under a male pseudonym. She attended a lecture on women's education organized by Miss Thornbury, a spinster who had inherited her father's bookshop and turned it into a gathering place for women who wanted to learn. She joined a literary society that met weekly to discuss novels and poetry and plays, where her opinions were solicited and valued and debated with genuine intellectual engagement. She began to write. Nothing she intended to publish. She had no illusions about her talent or the market for her observations, but essays about marriage and society and the particular kind of loneliness that came from living with someone who did not see you. She wrote them for herself, in the quiet hours of the morning when the house was still and the street outside was empty except for the milk cart making its rounds. And in writing them, she found a voice she had not known she possessed. One afternoon in December, she was in a bookshop in Covent Garden searching for a copy of Mary Wollstonecraft when a man approached her. He was perhaps 35, dressed in the slightly shabby coat of someone who valued books more than tailoring, with ink stains on his fingers, and the distracted air of someone whose thoughts were perpetually elsewhere. "Forgive me," he said, "but I could not help noticing you are looking at Wollstonecraft. Are you familiar with her work?" Amelia looked up. She'd been approached by men in public before. It was one of the unexpected complications of living without a husband's protection, and she had developed a repertoire of responses designed to discourage unwanted attention. But something about this man's tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than improper interest. "I am," she said carefully. "I find her arguments compelling, though not universally applicable." "Not universally applicable," he repeated, as though testing the phrase. "An interesting qualification. Which arguments do you find limited?" And they began to talk. His name was Thomas Whitfield. He was a scholar, he explained, attached to no particular institution, but engaged in ongoing research about political philosophy and social reform. He asked about her thoughts on Wollstonecraft's views on education. She asked about his work on governance. They stood in the bookshop for 40 minutes, discussing ideas with the kind of engaged, genuine interest that Amelia had not experienced since her father's death 5 years ago. When they parted, he asked if he might call on her to continue the conversation. She hesitated. She was no longer a respectable married woman. She was a scandal, a divorced woman living alone, someone whose reputation was already thoroughly compromised. Receiving male visitors would only make things worse. But then she thought about the portrait gallery and Edmund's careful plans and the waltz she had danced alone, and she realized that she had already decided, that night, that respectability was no longer something she valued more than her own agency. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." He called the following week. They discussed philosophy and literature and the particular ways that society constrained both men and women, though in different forms. He returned a week later, and then again, and slowly, carefully, with no particular agenda beyond genuine intellectual companionship, they became friends. It was not romance. Amelia had no interest in romance, in the kind of overwhelming passion that clouded judgment and led to poor decisions. What she had instead was partnership, someone who saw her mind and valued it, someone who asked her opinions and listened to the answers, someone who treated her not as furniture to be managed or a scandal to be avoided, but as a person worth knowing. 6 months after the ball, Edmund's divorce was finalized. The settlement was modest but fair. Amelia received her grandmother's inheritance back in full, plus a small annual sum that Edmund's solicitor had grudgingly agreed to in exchange for Amelia's agreement not to contest the proceedings. Catherine Hartley became Catherine Ashworth within a month of the divorce being granted. The wedding was small and private, which Amelia heard about through Mrs. Phillips, who had a remarkable network of gossip despite her general disdain for society. One evening in late spring, nearly a year after the ball, Amelia was in her sitting room reading when her housekeeper announced a visitor. "A Lady Kellington to see you, ma'am." Amelia looked up, confused. She was no longer Lady Kellington. That title now belonged to Catherine. But then Edmund's mother walked into the room, and Amelia understood. The Dowager Viscountess Kellington looked older than Amelia remembered, smaller somehow, as though the past year had diminished her. She stood in the doorway of Amelia's modest sitting room with the expression of someone who had arrived somewhere they would prefer not to be, but had decided was necessary. "Lady Kellington," Amelia said, rising, "this is unexpected." "Miss Thornton," the Dowager said. She had reverted to using Amelia's maiden name, which was both technically correct and subtly cutting. "I hope I am not intruding." "Not at all. Please sit." The Dowager sat. She did not remove her gloves, which suggested she did not intend to stay long. She looked around the room, at the modest furniture, the stacks of books, the writing desk with its scattered papers, and her expression was complicated. "I came," she said finally, "to apologize." Amelia blinked. Of all the things she had expected Edmund's mother to say, that was not one of them. "Apologize for what?" "For my son's behavior, for the manner in which he ended your marriage, for the assumptions I made about you during the 3 years you were part of our family." The Dowager's voice was stiff, as though the words were difficult to produce. "I believed you were fortunate to have married Edmund. I believed you should be grateful for the position he provided you. I did not understand that marriage should be more than position." She paused. "My marriage to Edmund's father was not affectionate. I managed. I assumed you would manage as well. I did not realize that managing was not the same as living." Amelia sat down slowly. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I've spent the past year watching my son's new marriage," the Dowager said. "And I have observed that he treats Catherine with the same dismissive indifference he showed you. She laughs less now. She has stopped attending social functions. And when I ask Edmund if she is well, he tells me she is simply adjusting to married life." The Dowager's hands tightened in her lap. "He has learned nothing, and I am beginning to understand that the problem was never you." Amelia looked at this woman who had presided over her marriage with cool detachment, who had expected Amelia to be grateful for Edmund's attention and accommodating of his neglect, who had written that terrible letter asking her to reconsider her rash behavior for the sake of the family's reputation. And she felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction at being vindicated, not pleasure at watching Edmund repeat his mistakes, but a kind of tired sympathy for a woman who had spent her entire life managing a marriage instead of living in one. "I am sorry Catherine is unhappy," Amelia said quietly, "but that is not my responsibility anymore." "I know," the Dowager said. "I'm not asking you to intervene. I simply wanted you to know that I was wrong, about you, about what marriage should be, about what I expected you to tolerate." She stood. "I will not take any more of your time." She walked to the door, then paused. "That night at the ball, when you danced alone, I was appalled. I thought you had destroyed yourself out of spite." She turned to look at Amelia. "But I think now that you were saving yourself, and I think Edmund never understood that he had married someone brave enough to do that." She left. Amelia sat in her sitting room for a long time after the Dowager's departure, thinking about courage and marriage and the different ways people saved themselves. 2 years after the ball, Amelia published her first essay under her own name. It was about marriage and autonomy and the particular kind of loneliness that came from being legally bound to someone who did not see you as a person. It was published in a small but respectable journal that Mrs. Phillips recommended, and it caused a minor scandal among the people who still cared about such things. Amelia did not care. She wrote more essays. She gave occasional lectures at Miss Thornberry's bookshop. And she continued her friendship with Thomas Whitfield, which had deepened over 2 years into something that looked, from the outside, very much like courtship, but felt, from the inside, like something rarer, genuine partnership between equals. They did not marry. Amelia had no interest in entering another legal arrangement that would transfer her property and autonomy to a man, even a man she trusted. Thomas understood this completely, being himself someone who valued independence and viewed marriage as an institution in need of considerable reform. Instead, they built something else, a collaboration, a companionship, a life that was constructed on mutual respect and intellectual engagement rather than legal obligation. And on the anniversary of the ball, 3 years after she had waltzed alone in front of 200 stunned guests, Amelia attended a salon at Mrs. Phillips's house and found herself telling the story. Not as a tragedy, not as a scandal, but as the beginning of something. "I thought I was ending something that night," she said to the circle of women gathered in Mrs. Phillips's drawing room. "I thought I was destroying my life in front of everyone who mattered, but what I was actually doing was choosing which life I wanted to live. And it turns out the life I chose, smaller, quieter, entirely mine, is better than the one I was performing for other people's approval." One of the younger women asked what had happened to Edmund. Amelia smiled. "He is still a viscount, still married to Catherine, still managing his life with the same careful attention to appearances that he brought to our marriage. I hear he is successful by the measures that matter to him." "And you?" someone else asked. "Are you successful by the measures that matter to you?" Amelia thought about her modest townhouse and her writing and her friendships and the life she had built from the wreckage of a failed marriage. She thought about the freedom of choosing her own path and the particular satisfaction of being seen, truly seen, by people who valued her mind. "Yes," she said, "I think I am." And in the warmth of that drawing room, surrounded by women who had also chosen their own paths in a society that insisted there was only one acceptable route, Amelia understood that the waltz she had danced alone had not been an ending at all. It had been an opening, a door she had walked through into a life that was uncertain and unconventional and entirely gloriously hers. The music had stopped years ago, but she was still dancing,